Sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen when we least expect them. Sometimes forgiveness finds us in the most unlikely places, changing everything we thought we knew about ourselves and others. In the Arizona desert, an old Apache warrior named Kestrel had given up hope that peace could exist between his people and the settlers. For 60 years, he watched promises broken and sacred lands taken away. His heart carried the weight of betrayal and loss. But one morning, he saw something that stopped him cold. A young white girl sat playing with a mountain lion cub, laughing, without fear. The animal was sacred to his people, yet this child treated it with pure respect and joy. The girl belonged to the same family that had betrayed his tribe years ago. What happened next would challenge everything Kestrel believed about enemies and forgiveness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the red canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the Arizona desert where Kestrel had walked for more than 6 decades. His weathered boots moved silently across the sandy earth, following paths his grandfather had shown him as a boy, paths that seemed to grow fainter with each passing season. The sacred eagle feather in his graying hair caught the early light, a reminder of traditions that felt as fragile as autumn leaves. Kestrel paused at the ridge overlooking the valley where his people had once gathered for ceremonies, where children had learned the old ways under stars that seemed brighter then. Now the land stretched before him, divided by fences and dotted with homesteads that belonged to people who would never understand its true significance. The desert still held its ancient magic, the way morning light transformed ordinary stones into jewels, the whisper of wind through sage that carried the voices of ancestors. But fewer and fewer people remained who could hear its stories. In his leather pouch, alongside sacred herbs and polished stones, Kestrel carried a yellowed fragment of paper. The broken treaty document had become his constant companion over the years, a reminder of promises made and promptly forgotten. 20 years ago, he had stood in the territorial office in Tucson, listening to government men speak of progress and civilization while they carved up his people's homeland with invisible lines on maps. The Whitmore family had been there that day, the grandfather eager to claim his stake in what he called empty land. Empty, as if centuries of Apache footsteps, prayers, and sacred ceremonies meant nothing. The betrayal still burned in Kestrel's chest, not with the fierce heat of youth, but with the steady ache of old wounds that never quite heal. He had trusted Samuel Whitmore's handshake, believed the old settlers' promises about sharing water rights and respecting sacred sites. Instead, fences had appeared overnight, cutting off access to springs his people had protected for generations. When Kestrel had confronted Samuel about the broken agreements, the man had simply shrugged and pointed to his legal papers, as if government seals could erase the deeper laws of the land. Now Samuel was gone, buried in the small cemetery behind his homestead, and his son had continued the family tradition of treating Apache concerns as inconveniences. But it was the grandchild who puzzled Kestrel most. 8-year-old Grace Whitmore, with her sun-bleached braids and eyes the color of summer sky. He had watched her from a distance, noting how she moved through the desert with unusual respect, never disturbing bird nests or trampling wildflowers. Unlike her family, she seemed to understand that the land was alive, that it deserved gentle treatment. The Whitmore homestead sat in a natural depression where a seasonal creek provided water most of the year. Samuel had chosen well, Kestrel admitted grudgingly. The location offered protection from desert winds and access to the underground springs that made farming possible in this harsh landscape. Adobe walls reflected the heat and carefully tended gardens showed that someone in the family understood desert agriculture. But the presence of the homestead still felt like a thorn in Kestrel's heart, a daily reminder of how his people's world continued to shrink. Grace's mother, Mary Whitmore, had been widowed 3 years ago when fever took her husband during a particularly harsh winter. Kestrel had observed her struggle to maintain the property and raise her daughter alone. Noting the determined set of her shoulders as she worked in the garden, the way she spoke gently to her animals, there was strength in this woman, the kind his own grandmother had possessed, quiet, enduring, rooted in love for family and land. Under different circumstances, he might have respected her. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than strangers separated by invisible walls of mistrust and history. The mountain lion family that denned in the rocky outcropping above the Whitmore homestead represented everything sacred to Kestrel's people. The great cats were symbols of courage and wisdom, guardians of the desert's spiritual heart. Apache children learned early to recognize their tracks, to understand their hunting patterns, to show proper respect when crossing their territory. The presence of the lions near the homestead created a delicate balance. They posed potential danger to livestock and humans, but they also blessed the land with their powerful medicine. Kestrel had been tracking the lion family for months, ensuring they had adequate prey and undisturbed denning sites. The mother was an impressive specimen, golden-coated and powerful, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to pierce straight into a person's soul. She had given birth to 2 cubs that spring, 1 male and 1 female, teaching them to hunt and survive in the unforgiving desert landscape. The male cub showed promising independence, but the female remained closer to her mother, learning the patient skills that would ensure her survival. As guardian of these sacred animals and protector of his people's remaining territory, Kestrel followed ancient responsibilities that seemed increasingly meaningless in a world that valued legal documents over spiritual obligations. He was perhaps the last of his generation to maintain the old patrol routes, to perform the traditional ceremonies that kept balance between human and animal communities. His own children had moved to the reservation or distant cities, choosing adaptation over tradition. He could not blame them. The world they faced required different skills than those he could teach, but their absence left him profoundly alone with his duties. Each morning, Kestrel rose before dawn to walk the boundaries of what his people still called sacred land, even though maps and deeds said otherwise. He carried no weapons except his grandfather's hunting knife, relying instead on knowledge accumulated over decades of desert living. He could read stories in animal tracks, predict weather from cloud formations, find water where others saw only barren rock. These skills felt precious and fragile, like ancient songs that might be forgotten if no one remained to sing them. The isolation had changed him over the years. Once, he had been known for his quick laughter and storytelling gifts, gathering children around evening fires to share the adventures of Coyote and the wisdom of Grandmother Spider. Now, days might pass without him speaking to another human being. The silence had become both burden and blessing. Burden because humans were meant for community. Blessing because solitude had taught him to hear subtler voices in wind and stone. And flowing water. Yet beneath his acceptance of solitude ran a deeper current of longing. Kestrel had never married, dedicating himself instead to serving as guardian and teacher for his community. But as that community scattered and traditions faded, he sometimes wondered if his sacrifices had been worth the cost. At 60, he felt the weight of unlived lives, unspoken words, unclaimed joys that might have been his if he had chosen differently. The desert morning continued to unfold around him as he made his way toward the lion territory, following game trails that wound between stands of mesquite and palo verde. Somewhere ahead lay the encounter that would change everything he thought he knew about enemies and forgiveness, though he had no way of knowing it yet. For now, he simply walked as he had walked for 6 decades, carrying his people's memories and maintaining the ancient watch that had become his life's purpose. The sun climbed higher, transforming the landscape from shadow and mystery into harsh clarity. Soon the heat would become oppressive, guiding both humans and animals to whatever shade they could find. But in these early hours, the desert belonged to those who understood its rhythms, who could move through its spaces with respect and ancient knowledge. Kestrel belonged to this land in ways that no legal document could define or deny. And despite all that had been lost, that belonging remained unbroken. The sound reached Kestrel before he crested the final ridge. Soft laughter carried on the morning breeze, innocent and joyful in a way that seemed impossible in this harsh landscape. He froze, every instinct honed by decades of desert living. Suddenly alert. Laughter meant people, and people in lion territory meant potential danger. His weathered hand moved instinctively to the carved wooden whistle hanging from his neck, a sacred Apache tool used for communicating with wildlife, its surface worn smooth by generations of careful use. Dropping to his belly, Kestrel crawled the last few yards to the ridgetop, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for approaching unseen. What he saw below defied everything he thought he knew about the settler family that had claimed his people's land. In the sandy clearing where the mountain lions often rested during the heat of the day, 8-year-old Grace Whitmore sat cross-legged in the dust, her blonde braids catching the sunlight as she played with something that made Kestrel's breath catch in his throat. A mountain lion cub, golden and spotted with the markings of youth, tumbled around the child like an oversized house cat. The little girl giggled as the cub pounced on her outstretched hand, its movements playful rather than predatory. Grace spoke to the animal in soft, gentle tones, the kind of voice Apache children were taught to use around sacred creatures. But this was a white child, granddaughter of the man who had broken faith with Kestrel's people, playing with an animal that most settlers would shoot on sight. "Easy, little one," Grace murmured, scratching behind the cub's ears. "Your mama will be back soon. She always comes back." The cub responded by butting its head against her palm, purring with a sound that carried clearly across the desert air. Kestrel watched, transfixed, as the child produced a small piece of dried meat from her pocket, offering it to the cub with the patience of someone much older. Every warrior instinct screamed at Kestrel to intervene. Mountain lions, even cubs, were dangerous wild animals. No matter how tame this one appeared, its natural instincts could surface without warning. The child was clearly unaware of the risk she faced, sitting defenseless in the open where the mother lion could return at any moment. Yet something held him motionless on the ridge, watching a scene that challenged everything he believed about the people who had taken his land. The cub was thin. Kestrel noticed, its ribs visible beneath the golden coat. An orphan, perhaps separated from its mother by accident or misfortune. Such cubs rarely survived without intervention, becoming easy prey for coyotes or simply starving in the unforgiving desert. But Grace seemed to understand this instinctively, offering food and companionship to a creature that nature had abandoned. Her movements showed none of the fear or dominance that characterized most human interactions with wild animals. Instead, she displayed the kind of respect that Apache children learned from their earliest years. "I know you miss your mama," Grace said softly, and the cub responded by curling up against her leg, seeking comfort in her presence. "But you're getting stronger every day. Soon you'll be big enough to find her again." The simple words revealed a depth of understanding that most adults never achieved. This child somehow grasped the temporary nature of her role in the cub's life, the importance of preparing it for eventual independence rather than creating permanent dependence. Kestrel's mind raced as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about the Whitmore family. Samuel Whitmore had been a hard man, driven by ambition and blind to the spiritual significance of the land he claimed. His son had continued that tradition, viewing the desert as something to be conquered rather than respected. But this child, this unexpected little girl, showed wisdom that her elders had never possessed. The wooden whistle felt warm against Kestrel's chest, as if the sacred tool was responding to the spiritual significance of the moment. For generations, his people had used such whistles to call to the animal spirits, to establish the bonds of respect and communication that allowed humans and wildlife to share the desert safely. Watching Grace with the cub, he realized she had achieved that same sacred connection without any training, guided only by an instinctive understanding of what the relationship required. A sound from the rocks above made both the child and the watching warrior freeze. The mother lion was returning, her massive form moving with fluid grace across the stone outcropping. Kestrel's heart hammered as he calculated distances and escape routes. Grace was too far from safety, too small to outrun a protective mother lion. One wrong move, one moment of startled fear, and tragedy would follow. But Grace seemed to sense the approaching presence without panic. She spoke quietly to the cub, her voice steady and calm. "Your mama's coming back, little one. Go to her now." The cub's ears perked up at some sound Kestrel couldn't detect, and it scrambled to its feet, looking toward the rocks where its mother waited. For a moment, the child and the young lion regarded each other with what could only be described as mutual understanding. "I'll see you tomorrow," Grace whispered, and the cub bounded away toward the rocky shelter where its mother waited. The reunion was brief, but telling the mother lion examined her offspring carefully, then looked directly toward where Grace still sat in the sandy clearing. For a long moment, the powerful predator and the small human child held each other's gaze across the desert space. Then, apparently satisfied that no threat existed, the mother lion guided her cub into the deeper shadows of their den. Grace remained sitting in the sand for several minutes after the lions disappeared, her face peaceful and content. She gathered up the few belongings she had brought: a small water container, some dried meat wrapped in cloth, a folded blanket that had served as her seat. Her movements were unhurried, respectful of the sacred space she was leaving. Only when she was completely ready did she stand and begin walking back toward her family's homestead. Kestrel watched her go, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. Everything he thought he knew about the Whitmore family, about the people who had claimed his ancestors' land, had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. This child possessed something that seemed impossible, the same deep respect for sacred animals that Apache children spent years learning to develop. She had somehow formed a bond with creatures that most of her people feared and hunted, showing wisdom that transcended the cultural barriers that separated their communities. As Grace disappeared over the ridge toward home, Kestrel remained motionless, processing the implications of what he had seen. The wooden whistle around his neck seemed to pulse with significance, reminding him of his role as guardian of both the sacred animals and the ancient knowledge they represented. A crossroads had appeared in his carefully ordered world, demanding a choice that would define not only his own future, but potentially the relationship between his people and the settlers who shared this land. For 60 years, Kestrel had maintained his solitary watch, protecting what remained of his people's sacred territory. He had accepted isolation as the price of guardianship, expecting to live out his remaining years in the same lonely service. But the sight of a white child, showing genuine reverence for Apache sacred animals, had cracked something open in his carefully guarded heart. Perhaps the rigid boundaries he had maintained for so long were not as necessary as he had believed. Perhaps in the most unlikely place and through the most unexpected person, a bridge could be built between two worlds that had seemed forever separated by mistrust and pain. 3 days passed before Kestrel found the courage to approach the clearing again. The image of Grace with the mountain lion cub had haunted his thoughts, challenging decades of carefully maintained boundaries between his world and theirs. When he finally crested the ridge at dawn, he discovered the child already there, sitting in the same spot with the cub curled contentedly in her lap. This time, however, Kestrel made no attempt to hide his presence. Grace looked up as his shadow fell across the sand, showing no fear at the sight of the weathered Apache warrior standing above her. Her blue eyes held the same calm acceptance she had shown the wild cub, as if dangerous things became safe simply through her refusal to treat them as threats. The cub, sensing the change in atmosphere, lifted its head and studied Kestrel with curious amber eyes. "Hello," Grace said simply, as if greeting an Apache warrior at dawn was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you here to see the cub too? He's getting stronger every day." Kestrel's hand moved instinctively to the medicine pouch hanging at his side. Its worn leather, containing sacred herbs and stones passed down through generations of his family. The pouch had been his grandmother's, filled with remedies for both body and spirit, and touching it always brought him comfort in moments of uncertainty. He needed that comfort now, facing a situation for which decades of warrior training had not prepared him. "You should not be here, child," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "This place is dangerous. Mother Lion will return, and she may not be as accepting of your presence as her cub." Grace considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful. "She's already seen me," she replied. "3 times now. She just watches to make sure I'm not hurting him, then goes back to hunting. I think she knows I'm trying to help." The casual way she spoke of multiple encounters with a protective mother lion made Kestrel's blood run cold. No adult in either community would believe such a story, yet he had witnessed enough to know the child spoke truth. Somehow, through innocence or instinct, she had established the kind of respectful relationship with dangerous predators that Apache warriors spent lifetimes learning to achieve. "What is your name, child?" Kestrel asked, settling cross-legged in the sand at a respectful distance. The formal gesture seemed to please Grace, who smiled and adjusted her position to face him properly. "Grace Whitmore," she said. "My mama calls me Gracie, but I like Grace better. It sounds more grown-up. What's your name?" "I am called Kestrel," he replied, using the English translation rather than his Apache name. "I watch over this land and the creatures that live here, like a guardian?" Grace asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "That's what I've been trying to do for the cub. Guard him until he's big enough to guard himself." The simplicity of her understanding struck Kestrel like a physical blow. This child had grasped, without teaching, the fundamental principle that guided Apache relationships with wildlife: temporary stewardship rather than permanent possession. Most adults in her community viewed wild animals as either property to be claimed or threats to be eliminated. But Grace somehow understood the sacred balance that required protection without dominance, care without capture. "Your family knows you come here?" Kestrel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Grace shook her head, her expression growing slightly guilty. "Mama would worry. She's been sad since Papa died, and I don't want to give her more things to worry about. But the cub needs help, and I'm the only one who found him." The mention of her father's death added another layer of complexity to the situation. Kestrel remembered the fever that had swept through the territory 3 winters ago, claiming several lives from both communities. Death had a way of changing family dynamics, often leaving survivors struggling with new responsibilities and old grief. Perhaps Grace's unusual independence stemmed from necessity as much as natural inclination. "Show me how you approach him," Kestrel said, nodding toward the cub. "Show me what you have learned." Grace's face brightened at the request. She moved slowly, keeping her hands visible, speaking in the same soft tones Kestrel had observed before. "Hello, little brave one," she murmured, extending her palm for the cub to sniff. "I brought you breakfast again. Are you hungry?" Kestrel watched with growing amazement as the child demonstrated techniques that mirrored Apache animal handling traditions. She never grabbed or restrained the cub, allowing it to approach on its own terms. She offered food from an open palm, teaching the young predator to take gently rather than snatch. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand the importance of maintaining the cub's wild instincts even while providing temporary care. "Who taught you to move that way?" Kestrel asked, when Grace had finished feeding the cub. "Nobody taught me," she said, looking puzzled by the question. "It just seems like the right way to treat something that could be scared or hurt. Wouldn't you want someone to be gentle with you if you were lost and hungry?" The innocent wisdom in her words revealed a depth of empathy that transcended cultural boundaries. Grace possessed what his people called animal heart, the ability to understand and communicate with creatures that most humans feared or dismissed. Such gifts appeared rarely, even among Apache children raised with traditional teachings. To find it in a white settler's granddaughter seemed impossible. Yet the evidence sat before him in the form of a wild cub that trusted her completely. "Your grandfather," Kestrel said carefully. "Samuel Whitmore. You knew him?" "Grandpa Sam died when I was little," Grace replied. "But Mama tells me stories about him. She says he came here to make a better life for his family, but that he made some mistakes along the way. She says he was sorry about the mistakes, especially the ones that hurt other people." The child's words carried implications that made Kestrel's heart race. Could Mary Whitmore know more about the true nature of the land disputes than she had ever revealed? The broken tree in his medicine pouch suddenly felt heavier, its yellowed edges representing not just betrayal, but perhaps misunderstanding that had festered for decades. "What kind of mistakes?" Kestrel asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. "Mama says he didn't understand that the land already belonged to other people," Grace said with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "She says he thought it was empty, but it wasn't really empty, just different from what he expected. She says the Apache people lived here first, and Grandpa Sam should have asked permission instead of just taking." The admission hung in the desert, air like morning mist, fragile and transformative. For 20 years, Kestrel had carried his anger and betrayal like armor, protecting himself from further hurt by maintaining rigid boundaries between his world and theirs. But this child's innocent revelation suggested that the truth might be more complex than he had allowed himself to believe. As the sun climbed higher and the desert heat began to build, Kestrel found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could maintain his isolation, continue his solitary guardianship, and let this remarkable child fade back into the settler community that had caused his people so much pain. Or he could step across the invisible line that had divided their worlds for decades, risking his heart, but potentially healing wounds that had seemed permanent. The mountain lion cub, drowsy from its meal and the growing warmth, curled up between them as if their presence together was the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, Kestrel realized that perhaps the sacred animals he had spent his life protecting were about to teach him the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in maintaining boundaries, but in finding the wisdom to cross them. The storytelling stone had been in Kestrel's family for 7 generations, a smooth river rock the size of a child's palm, polished by countless hands and countless tellings. His grandmother had taught him that stories lived in the stone, waiting to be awakened by the right voice and the right listener. As he held it now, sitting across from Grace in the sandy clearing, he felt the familiar weight of tradition and the unfamiliar lightness of hope. "Every animal in the desert has a story," Kestrel began, turning the stone slowly in his weathered hands. "The mountain lion's story is one of the oldest and most sacred to my people." Grace leaned forward, her attention complete and respectful. The cub, now comfortable with Kestrel's presence, dozed in a patch of morning shade between them. Over the past week, their dawn meetings had become routine, each encounter deepening the unlikely bond forming between an aging Apache guardian and a curious settler child. Long ago, Kestrel continued, when the world was younger and the spirits walked more freely among us, the Great Spirit gave each animal a special gift. To the eagle, he gave the power to touch the sky. To the coyote, he gave cunning to survive in any situation. But to the mountain lion, he gave the most precious gift of all, the courage to face any challenge without losing wisdom. That's why you respect them so much, Grace said softly, understanding dawning in her blue eyes. They're like teachers. Yes, Kestrel nodded, pleased by her insight. In Apache tradition, when a mountain lion crosses your path, it means you are being called to find your own courage and wisdom. This cub, he gestured toward the sleeping animal, appearing in your life is no accident. Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Then she spoke with the thoughtful seriousness that characterized all her observations. Grandpa Sam used to tell me stories too, before he died. But his stories were different. He talked about coming west to escape something back east, about wanting to make a fresh start where nobody knew his mistakes. The mention of Samuel Whitmore sent a familiar spike of anger through Kestrel's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Grace's perspective on her grandfather was clearly complicated by love and loss, and he would not taint those memories with his own pain. Not yet. What kinds of mistakes? He asked gently, the same question that had haunted him since their first conversation. Mama says he lost everything gambling back in Missouri, Grace replied. The farm, Grandma's jewelry, even the money saved for my father's education. Papa was so angry that he wouldn't speak to Grandpa Sam for almost 2 years. That's why they came here. Grandpa Sam thought if he could build something valuable in the territory, he could earn Papa's forgiveness. This revelation cast Samuel Whitmore's aggressive land claiming in a different light. Kestrel had always assumed the man was driven by simple greed, but perhaps desperation and family shame had motivated his actions. The distinction mattered less than he expected. The damage to Apache land rights remained the same regardless of the settlers' motivations. But understanding those motivations created space for something other than pure hatred. Your father forgave him? Kestrel asked. Eventually, Grace nodded. Especially after I was born. Grandpa Sam loved me something fierce, Mama says. He used to carry me around the property, showing me every plant and rock like they were treasures. He said this land was going to be my inheritance, something nobody could ever take away from Emmy. The irony was sharp enough to cut Samuel Whitmore promising his granddaughter permanent ownership of land that legally belonged to someone else. But looking at Grace now, seeing her genuine care for the desert and its creatures, Kestrel wondered if perhaps the old man's promise could be honored in ways he never intended. Tell me about your father, Kestrel said, curious about the man who had bridged the gap between Samuel's ambition and Grace's wisdom. Grace's face brightened at the request. Papa was different from Grandpa Sam, quieter, more thoughtful. He read books about desert farming and Indian traditions. He said if we were going to live here, we should learn from the people who understood the land best. This was new information, and it sent Kestrel's mind racing. He had observed the Whitmore property from a distance, but had never noticed any signs of Apache agricultural techniques being employed. Perhaps the son's interest in native methods had died with him, another casualty of the fever that had claimed so many lives. He was trying to learn Apache ways? Kestrel asked. He bought books from a trader in Tucson, Grace said. Books about desert plants and water conservation. He even learned some Apache words, though Mama says his pronunciation was terrible. She giggled at the memory, then grew serious again. He was planning to find someone from your people to teach him properly, but then he got sick. The mist. Opportunity hung between them like morning mist. If Grace's father had succeeded in making contact with Apache farmers, if he had approached Kestrel's community with respect and genuine desire to learn how different the past 20 years might have been. Instead of suspicious neighbors maintaining rigid boundaries, they might have become partners in the challenging work of desert survival. "Your mother," Kestrel said carefully. "She continues his interest in Apache ways?" Grace's expression grew complicated. "Mama tries, but she's scared of doing things wrong. She says white people have hurt your people so much that she doesn't know how to approach without making things worse. She grows some of the plants Papa learned about, but she won't admit where the knowledge came from." This revelation about Mary Whitmore challenged Kestrel's assumptions once again. He had observed her from a distance, noting her competent management of the farm and her gentle treatment of animals. But he had assumed she shared her father-in-law's indifference to Apache concerns. Learning that fear rather than prejudice kept her isolated added another layer to an already complex situation. "What would happen," Kestrel asked slowly, "if your mother knew you were meeting with me?" Grace considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful. "She'd be scared at first," she admitted. "But Mama's smart, and she's fair. If she saw that you were teaching me good things, if she understood that you cared about the land and the animals the same way Papa did, I think she'd want to learn too." The possibility opened like a flower in Kestrel's mind, tentative, fragile, but radiant with potential. For years, he had viewed the Whitmore homestead as an intrusion, a symbol of everything his people had lost. But perhaps it could become something different, a bridge between communities, a place where ancient wisdom and new circumstances could create something neither culture could achieve alone. The storytelling stone grew warm in his palm as these thoughts took shape. Change was coming whether he welcomed it or not, carried on the innocent wisdom of a child who saw possibilities where adults saw only problems. The question was whether he possessed the courage the mountain lion represented, the strength to face uncertainty without losing the wisdom that had guided him this far. The silver bracelet had belonged to Kestrel's daughter, crafted by her own small hands during the winter before the fever came. Intricate patterns of mountains and eagles decorated the band, each tiny figure hammered with the patience and precision that had marked everything Morning Star touched. For 15 years, Kestrel had carried the bracelet in his medicine pouch, unable to wear it but equally unable to let it go. Now, as he watched Grace gentle the mountain lion cub with the same careful hands his daughter had possessed, the weight of that silver memory felt both heavier and lighter than ever before. "The cub's mother has been watching us," Grace observed, her voice barely above a whisper. They had been meeting for 2 weeks now, and she had grown remarkably skilled at reading the subtle signs of wildlife activity around their clearing. "She's in the rocks above us, isn't she?" Kestrel nodded, impressed by her developing awareness. "She has been there since we arrived. Mountain lions are cautious mothers. She needs to understand our intentions before she fully accepts our presence." "How? Can we show her we're safe?" Grace asked, genuine concern coloring her voice. The question revealed the depth of her commitment to the cub's welfare, her understanding that their relationship existed within a larger family dynamic that required respect. "Patience," Kestrel replied. "In Apache tradition, trust is built slowly, through consistent actions rather than words. The mother sees how you treat her child, how you prepare him for independence rather than dependence. This matters more than any gesture we could make." Grace nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that had been building between them for days. "Will you tell me about your family? You know all about mine, but I don't know anything about yours." The directness of childhood had a way of cutting through defenses that years of careful construction couldn't protect. Kestrel felt the silver bracelet's weight against his chest and made a decision that surprised him with its suddenness. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly. "Her name was Morning Star, and she would have been 23 years old this summer." Grace's eyes widened with immediate understanding. "The fever," she said softly. Mama told me it took children from both our communities. Yes, Kestrel confirmed, his voice steady despite the pain that talking about Morning Star always brought. She was 8 years old when she died. The same age you are now. The parallel hung between them, impossible to ignore. Grace seemed to sense the significance, her expression growing solemn with the weight of understanding. Is that why you've been so kind to me? Because I remind you of her? Kestrel considered the question carefully, wanting to give her the complete truth rather than a simplified answer. At first, perhaps. But you have become important to me for your own sake, not because you remind me of someone else. You have gifts that Morning Star never had the chance to develop, wisdom that comes from your own heart. What was she like? Grace asked, settling more comfortably in the sand. The cub, sensing the shift to more serious conversation, curled up between them as if understanding its role as bridge between their worlds. She was curious about everything, Kestrel began, surprised by how easily the memories came once he allowed them. She asked questions from the moment she learned to speak until the moment he paused, gathering himself. She wanted to understand how everything worked, why the seasons changed, why different animals behaved as they did. She would have been fascinated by your relationship with this cub. Would she have liked me? Grace asked with the vulnerable honesty that made her so easy to care for. She would have loved you, Kestrel said with complete certainty. You have the same respect for living things that she did, the same willingness to see beauty where others see only danger or inconvenience. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cub play with a stick that Grace had brought. The simple contentment of the moment felt precious to Kestrel, a gift he had never expected to receive again. Caring for a child, sharing knowledge and stories, feeling the particular joy that came from watching young minds grow, these experiences had died with Morning Star, or so he had believed. The people in town, Grace said eventually, they don't understand why Mama and I live out here alone. They think we should move to somewhere safer, somewhere with more neighbors. What do you think? Kestrel asked, curious about her perspective on the isolation that shaped both their lives. I think they're afraid of things they don't understand, Grace replied with startling insight. They see the desert as empty and dangerous because they don't know how to listen to it. But it's not empty at all. It's full of stories and life and beauty. Moving away would be like losing half of who I am. Her words echoed sentiments that Kestrel had carried his entire life but had rarely heard expressed by someone from the settler community. Grace understood instinctively what many adults never grasped, that place and identity were intertwined in ways that transcended simple geography. Your mother feels the same way? He asked. I think so, but she worries about keeping me safe and educated. She teaches me reading and arithmetic herself, but she knows I'm missing things that other children learn in town schools. Grace's expression grew thoughtful. Sometimes I wish there was a way to have both, the safety and community of town life, but still be able to live here where everything feels right. The wistful quality in her voice spoke to dreams that seemed impossible given the current tensions between communities. Yet listening to her, Kestrel began to imagine possibilities that hadn't occurred to him before. What if the isolation that both families experienced wasn't necessary? What if the boundaries that seemed so fixed could actually be redrawn? The cub is growing stronger, he observed, changing the subject as the mountain lion family dynamics shifted above them. The mother had moved closer, no longer hiding her presence as she watched their interaction. She's starting to trust us, Grace said with satisfaction. Maybe someday she'll let us get close enough to make sure she's healthy too. Perhaps, Kestrel agreed, though he wondered if Grace understood the full implications of what she was suggesting. Building trust with a wild mountain lion family was a sacred undertaking in Apache tradition, not something to be approached lightly. Yet watching the child's natural ability to communicate with dangerous predators, He found himself believing that she might be capable of achieving connections that even experienced warriors rarely accomplished. The silver bracelet seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, as if Morning Star's spirit was offering approval for this unexpected turn his life had taken. Perhaps the gift of caring for a child didn't have to die with his daughter. Perhaps Grace's appearance in his carefully ordered world was less accident than destiny, offering healing for wounds he had thought would never close. The war paint bowl had not been used for its original purpose in over 20 years. Made from clay gathered at sacred sites and fired in ceremonial flames, it had once held the pigments that marked Apache warriors for battle and young people, for coming-of-age rituals. Now it held only memories and the faint stains of its last use. When Kestrel had painted his face for what he believed would be his final confrontation with the cavalry soldiers who came to escort his people to the reservation. But as he held the bowl in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing for what might be the most important decision of his life, its weight felt different. Not the burden of war, but the possibility of transformation. 3 weeks had passed since that first encounter with Grace, and their morning meetings had become the center around which both their days revolved. But the time had come for the next step, one that would either bridge their two worlds or destroy the fragile trust they had built. Today, Kestrel planned to reveal himself to Mary Whitmore, to step fully into the light and risk everything on the hope that Grace's wisdom might be inherited rather than unique. "You're nervous," Grace observed as they sat together in the clearing, the mountain lion cub now comfortable enough to sleep draped across both their laps. Her ability to read emotions had grown sharper with each passing day, part of the general awareness that seemed to expand whenever she spent time in the desert. "Yes," Kestrel admitted, seeing no point in deception with someone so perceptive. "Today I must make a choice that will change everything between our families. I hope it will be for the better, but change always carries risks." "You going to tell Mama about our meetings?" Grace said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what that meant for both of them. "It is time," Kestrel replied. "These secret meetings cannot continue indefinitely, and your mother deserves to know where you spend your mornings. More than that, I believe she may be ready to hear truths that have remained hidden for too long." Grace was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking the cub's golden fur as she processed this development. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone much older. "Mama's been asking questions about where I go and why I'm so happy lately. She's not suspicious exactly, but she's curious. I think part of her already knows something important is happening. What will you tell her when she asks directly?" Kestrel wanted to understand Grace's perspective before making his own approach. "The truth," Grace said simply. "That I met someone who teaches me about the desert and the animals. Someone who helps me understand why this land feels like home, even though I was born here. She'd be scared at first, but Mama's fair. She'll listen." The confidence in her voice both reassured and worried Kestrel. Grace's faith in her mother's fairness might be justified, but fear had a way of overwhelming even the most reasonable people when they felt their children were threatened. Mary Whitmore's reaction to discovering her daughter had been meeting secretly with an Apache warrior could easily tip toward panic rather than understanding. "There is something else you should know," Kestrel said carefully, "before I speak with your mother. Something about the land your family lives on, about the original agreements between your grandfather and my people." Grace's attention sharpened, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What kind of something?" Kestrel reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew the yellowed fragment of the broken treaty, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "This document contains the true terms of the agreement your grandfather made with Apache leaders 20 years ago. Terms that were never honored, promises that were broken almost immediately." Grace leaned forward to examine the paper, her young eyes tracing the faded words with growing understanding. This says Grandpa Sam was supposed to share water rights and allow access to sacred sites. It says the land was being held in trust, not sold outright. Your grandfather signed this agreement in good faith, Kestrel explained, his voice carefully neutral. But when territorial officials arrived with different papers, legal documents that contradicted these terms, he chose to honor their authority rather than his word to my people. The weight of this revelation settled over Grace like a physical thing. She understood intuitively that this information changed everything about her family's claim to the land she loved, everything about the relationship between their communities. So we don't really own the homestead? Ownership is a complex matter, Kestrel replied. According to territorial law, your family holds clear title. According to Apache law and the original agreement, the land remains in sacred trust. Both truths exist simultaneously, creating a situation that has never been resolved. Grace absorbed this in the thoughtful silence that characterized her approach to difficult problems. When she finally spoke, her words revealed wisdom that continued to astonish Kestrel. Maybe that's why the land always felt like it belonged to someone else, even though we lived here. Maybe that's why Papa was so interested in learning Apache ways. He sensed something was incomplete. Perhaps, Kestrel agreed, impressed once again by her intuitive understanding of complex situations. Your father may have felt the spiritual imbalance that unresolved promises create. What happens now? Grace asked. If you tell Mama about the original agreement, what does that mean for us? Kestrel had wrestled with this question for days, weighing justice against compassion, legal rights against practical realities. That depends on what your mother chooses to do with the truth. She could demand that Apache claims be legally recognized, forcing your family to leave. She could ignore the information entirely, maintaining the current situation. Or she could choose a third path, finding a way to honor the original agreement while allowing your family to remain. A third path, Grace repeated, her eyes lighting up with possibility. Like what Papa wanted to do, learning from Apache wisdom while building something new. Yes, Kestrel nodded. But such a path would require courage from both our communities. Willingness to risk the familiar for the possibility of something better. The mountain lion cubs stirred in their laps, disturbed by some sound only its keen ears could detect. Above them, the mother lion moved restlessly among the rocks, her anxiety communicating itself to her offspring. Grace responded immediately, her hands gentling the cub, while her voice murmured the soft reassurances that always calmed the wild creature. She senses change coming, Grace observed, watching the mother lion pace. Animals always know when important things are about to happen. Then we must proceed with extra care, Kestrel replied. Change that comes too quickly can frighten even the bravest hearts. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper, they prepared to end their meeting with a ritual that had developed naturally over the weeks. Grace would say goodbye to the cub first, ensuring it returned safely to its mother before she left for home. Then Kestrel would remain behind, performing the small ceremony of thanks that honored both the sacred animals and the land that sheltered them. But today felt different, charged with the energy of approaching transformation. The war paint bowl seemed to pulse with significance in Kestrel's hands, reminding him that some battles were fought not with weapons, but with words. Not through conquest, but through the harder work of building trust across seemingly impossible divides. When you speak with Mama, Grace said as they prepared to part, remember that she loved Papa very much, and he believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. If you can help her see that honoring the original agreement is what Papa would have wanted, she'd find the courage to try. Her words offered both guidance and hope, suggesting that Mary Whitmore might indeed possess the strength necessary for the choice that lay ahead. As Grace disappeared over the ridge toward home, Kestrel remained in the clearing, holding the war paint bowl and contemplating the transformation from warrior to peacemaker that this day would demand. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time in decades, he believed that peace between their communities might be more than just an impossible dream. The hidden land deed lay buried beneath 3 decades of accumulated papers in Samuel Whitmer's old desk, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with wax that had long since cracked and yellowed. Mary Whitmore had been searching for her late husband's agricultural notes when her fingers brushed against the unfamiliar packet, wedged behind a drawer that had never fully closed properly. As she worked it free and unfolded the brittle document, her world shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The deed bore the official territorial seal, dated 6 months before Samuel Whitmer's first meeting with Apache leaders, and its contents contradicted everything her family had believed about their legal claim to the homestead. According to this document, the land had never been available for homesteading at all. It remained under federal protection as part of a treaty preserve established to honor Apache territorial rights. Samuel Whitmore had built his dreams and his family's future on land that belonged to someone else, and he had known it from the beginning. Mary's hands trembled as she read the document twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow change or reveal themselves to be forgeries. But the seal was genuine, the signatures legitimate, and the implications devastating. Everything she had understood about her father-in-law's character, everything she had believed about her family's rightful place in this desert landscape, crumbled like old adobe in the relentless wind. The sound of Grace's laughter drifted through the open window, and Mary looked up to see her daughter playing in the garden, completely innocent of the bombshell that had just exploded in their quiet morning. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that their entire life was built on a lie? How could she help Grace understand that the land she loved so deeply, the place that felt like home in every fiber of her being, might have to be surrendered to its rightful owners? But beneath the shock and grief, another emotion stirred, one that surprised Mary with its intensity: relief. For years, she had felt the weight of unfinished business in her relationship with the Apache community, a sense that old wounds festered beneath the surface of their careful mutual avoidance. Her husband had shared that feeling, spending his final years researching Apache agricultural techniques and cultural practices in what she now realized was an attempt to bridge the gap his father had created. Perhaps this devastating revelation also offered an opportunity for the healing that had seemed impossible while the truth remained buried. The second document in the packet made the situation even more complex. Samuel Whitmer's confession, written in his own shaking hand during the fever that would eventually claim his life, revealed the full scope of his deception. "I came west to escape the shame of my gambling debts, hoping to build something valuable, enough to earn my son's forgiveness and provide for my granddaughter's future. When I learned that the land I wanted was protected Apache territory, I convinced myself that territorial officials would eventually overrule the treaty anyway. I thought I was simply claiming what would inevitably become available to settlers. But I was wrong to break faith with Kestrel's people, wrong to take what was not mine to take. My granddaughter Grace loves this land with the same reverence her Apache neighbors show. Perhaps she can find a way to honor both claims where I failed." The mention of Kestrel by name sent Mary's heart racing. She had heard stories about the Apache guardian who watched over the sacred sites near their homestead, but she had never imagined that her father-in-law had dealt with him directly. The confession suggested a relationship more complex than simple adversaries, hinting at respect and regret that had never been publicly acknowledged. As Mary sat surrounded by the scattered papers of 3 decades, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered, Grace burst through the front door with her usual boundless energy. But today her daughter's face carried an unusual solemnity, an expression that suggested important news of her own. "Mama," Grace began, then stopped, apparently struggling with how to begin a difficult conversation. "I need to tell you something important, something that might change everything." Mary almost laughed at the timing her daughter announcing life-changing news just moments after she had uncovered the most devastating secret in their family's history. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I've been meeting someone," Grace said, her words careful and measured. "Someone who's been teaching me about the desert and the animals. Someone Apache." The coincidence was too remarkable to ignore. Mary felt the universe shifting around her, arranging circumstances with a precision that suggested forces beyond human control. "Tell me about these meetings," she said gently, setting aside the legal documents to focus completely on her daughter. Grace's story unfolded with the clarity and honesty that characterized everything she shared. The mountain lion cub, the patient teaching, the growing bond with an Apache elder who treated her with kindness and respect. Each detail painted a picture that challenged every assumption Mary had made about the impossible gulf between their communities. "His name is Kestrel," Grace concluded, "and he's been protecting this land and its animals for longer than I've been alive. He knows about Grandpa Sam, about the promises that were broken. He wants to talk with you to find a way to make things right." Mary stared at her daughter, struggling to comprehend the complexity of what was happening. Grace had somehow formed exactly the connection that her husband had dreamed of establishing, building a bridge across cultural divides that had seemed insurmountable. And now, with Samuel Whitmore's confession in her hands, Mary possessed the truth that might make genuine reconciliation possible. "Grace," she said slowly, "what would you say if I told you that our family doesn't actually own this land? That Grandpa Sam took it from people who had a prior claim?" Grace considered this with the thoughtfulness that marked all her serious conversations. "I'd say that explains why the land always felt like it belonged to someone else, even though we loved it. I'd say maybe that's why Kestrel and I became friends, because the land wanted us to find a way to share it properly." The wisdom in her daughter's response gave Mary the courage to make a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour before. "Would you ask Kestrel to come here tomorrow morning? To our house, where we can talk openly about what needs to happen next?" Grace's face lit up with joy and relief. "You want to meet him? You're not angry about the secret meetings?" "I'm not angry," Mary assured her, though the emotions swirling through her were too complex for simple labels. "I think your secret meetings may have been exactly what our families needed, even if we didn't realize it at the time." That evening, as Mary sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, she felt the weight of impending change settling over their quiet homestead. Tomorrow would bring conversations that could not be taken back, decisions that would reshape not only their family's future, but potentially the relationship between two communities that had circled each other warily for decades. Thought the hidden land deed lay on the table beside her, its damning evidence of deception balanced against the possibility of redemption that Grace's friendship with Kestrel represented. For the first time since her husband's death, Mary felt that the future held promise rather than mere survival. The path forward remained uncertain, but at least now she could see it clearly, illuminated by truth rather than obscured by old lies and older fears. The sacred firestones had been gathered from 7 different holy sites across Apache territory, each one carrying the spiritual weight of generations who had used them for the most important ceremonies of tribal life. As Kestrel arranged them, in the ancient pattern his grandfather had taught him, preparing for what might be the most significant ritual of his lifetime, the desert around him seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. These stones had witnessed peace negotiations coming of age, ceremonies, and the sacred transitions that marked the passage from one life phase to another. Today, they would witness an attempt to heal wounds that had festered for 20 years. The meeting with Mary Whitmore had gone better than Kestrel's most optimistic hopes could have imagined. When Grace led him to the homestead's front porch, That morning, he had prepared himself for anger, denial, perhaps even violence. Instead, Mary had greeted him with the dignity his grandmother had always shown to honored guests, offering water and shade before beginning the difficult conversation that would determine both families' futures. Mary's revelation of the hidden land deed had struck Kestrel like lightning, sudden, illuminating, and fundamentally transformative. For 20 years, he had carried the bitter certainty that Samuel Whitmore had knowingly betrayed Apache trust, choosing personal gain over sacred obligations. Learning that the old settler had actually been deceived by territorial officials, that his betrayal had been unintentional rather than calculated, shifted the entire foundation of Kestrel's anger. Samuel Whitmore had been a flawed man making desperate choices, not the calculating enemy that decades of resentment had created in Kestrel's memory. But even more significant was Mary's response to learning the truth about her family's legal status. Rather than clinging to false claims or demanding protection of her investment, she had immediately begun planning how to honor the original agreement her father-in-law had signed. Her husband's dream of partnership with Apache neighbors could finally be realized. She declared, if Kestrel was willing to help her find a way forward that respected both communities, and eased out the formal reconciliation ceremony they were now planning would involve not just their two families, but representatives from both the Apache Tribal Council and the settler community around Tucson. Word had spread quickly through both populations, generating reactions that ranged from enthusiastic support to worried skepticism. Change always frightened some people, especially change that challenged long-held assumptions about land rights and cultural boundaries. Grace had become the unofficial ambassador between communities, her innocent enthusiasm and obvious happiness serving as living proof that cooperation was possible. She had spent the past week visiting Apache families with Kestrel, learning traditional crafts and games while teaching settler children songs and stories in return. Her natural gift for languages had allowed her to pick up basic Apache phrases with remarkable speed, and her respectful approach to sacred sites and customs had won approval from even the most traditional tribal elders. The mountain lion cub had grown noticeably larger and more independent during the weeks of their friendship, but the approaching ceremony would mark a formal farewell as it rejoined its mother's territory permanently. Grace had accepted this necessity with the wisdom that characterized all her decisions, understanding that true love sometimes required letting go. The cub's successful return to the wild would serve as a powerful symbol during the reconciliation ritual, representing the possibility that seemingly impossible relationships could flourish when approached with proper respect and patience. Kestrel's own transformation felt equally dramatic. For decades, he had defined himself as a guardian standing watch against outside threats, maintaining ancient boundaries through vigilance and solitude. But Grace's friendship had awakened possibilities he had forgotten existed. The joy of teaching eager students, the satisfaction of building bridges rather than walls, the hope that traditions could evolve and grow rather than simply endure in isolation. The role of cultural liaison that Mary had proposed would allow him to continue serving his people while engaging with the broader community in ways that felt both natural and necessary. The ceremony itself had been designed through careful collaboration between Apache spiritual leaders and Mary Whitmore, blending traditional ritual elements with practical legal arrangements that would satisfy both communities' concerns. The hidden land deed would be formally acknowledged, but rather than forcing the Whitmore family to leave, a new agreement would establish shared stewardship arrangements that honored both the original Apache claims and the years of labor Mary's family had invested in improving the property. Water rights, the source of so much conflict in desert communities, would be managed cooperatively, with Apache knowledge of underground springs and seasonal patterns combined with settler innovations in conservation and distribution. Sacred sites would be protected and made accessible for traditional ceremonies, while the homestead's agricultural areas would continue to provide food and income for both families. Most importantly, the arrangement would serve as a model for other disputed territories, demonstrating that historical wrongs could be addressed without creating new injustices. The tribal council's response to these proposals had been cautiously optimistic. Elder Joseph Running Bear, speaking for the traditional faction, had expressed surprise that any settler family would voluntarily acknowledge Apache land rights, let alone propose genuine power-sharing arrangements. But he had also noted the spiritual significance of Grace's connection to the mountain lion family, interpreting it as a sign that the Great Spirit approved of reconciliation efforts. Younger tribal members, led by Kestrel's nephew, David Crow Feather, had embraced the opportunity to engage with sympathetic settlers as a way of building broader coalitions for Apache rights. David had spent years working within territorial legal systems, fighting for recognition of treaty obligations that officials preferred to ignore. The Whitmore precedent could provide legal leverage for similar negotiations throughout the region. The settler community's reactions proved more varied and complex. Some families, particularly those with young children who might benefit from Apache knowledge of desert survival, supported the arrangement enthusiastically. Others worried about setting precedents that might threaten their own land claims or create demands for similar accommodations. A few had expressed frank hostility, viewing any recognition of Apache rights as a betrayal of white civilization's manifest destiny. Mary had handled these concerns with diplomacy and practical wisdom, emphasizing the benefits that cultural exchange could bring to all desert residents. Apache agricultural techniques could increase crop yields and reduce water consumption. Traditional knowledge of medicinal plants could supplement the limited medical care available in remote settlements. Most importantly, cooperation would reduce the constant tension and fear that characterized relationships between communities that viewed each other as threats rather than potential allies. The ceremony location itself carried deep significance. The sandy clearing where Kestrel and Grace had first bonded over the mountain lion cub would be transformed into a permanent teaching circle, marked with stones and blessed by both Apache spiritual leaders and Mary's Episcopal minister. The site would serve as a regular meeting place for ongoing cultural exchanges, a neutral ground where both communities could gather for education, celebration, and conflict resolution. As Kestrel completed his arrangements of the sacred fire stones, he felt the weight of ancestral expectations settling over his shoulders like a ceremonial blanket. Generations of his people had dreamed of peace with their neighbors, of relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. Tomorrow's ceremony would either fulfill those dreams or demonstrate their impossibility. There would be no middle ground, no partial success that could satisfy the spiritual requirements of the ritual he was preparing to lead. The approaching sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that would mark tomorrow's dawn when the ceremony began. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, the mountain lion family settled into their evening routine, secure in territory that would soon be formally protected through cooperation rather than conflict. And in the Whitmore homestead, Mary and Grace prepared for a night that would end their old life and begin something entirely new, a future built on truth rather than buried secrets, on shared stewardship rather than disputed ownership. The sacred firestones seemed to pulse with anticipation as full darkness fell, their ancient power awakening in response to the approaching ceremony. Tomorrow would test everything Kestrel believed about the possibility of redemption, the power of forgiveness to heal old wounds, and the courage required to choose hope over the familiar comfort of old grievances. But tonight, surrounded by the desert's eternal presence and the stones that had witnessed countless other moments of transformation, he felt ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The eagle feather staff had been carried by Kestrel's grandfather during the last Great Peace Council between Apache tribes and territorial officials, 40 years before the current crisis had begun. Carved from sacred wood and adorned with feathers. From eagles that had soared over Apache territory for generations. It represented the bridge between earth and spirit that all true leaders must maintain. As dawn light touched the desert and participants began gathering for the reconciliation ceremony, Kestrel lifted the staff with hands that trembled slightly from the magnitude of what this day would accomplish. The clearing had been transformed overnight through the combined efforts of both communities. Apache families had contributed traditional elements. The sacred firestones arranged in ancient patterns, cedar boughs for purification, drums whose rhythms would guide the ceremonies. Spiritual progression. Settler families had added practical touches, wooden benches for elderly participants, canvas shade cloths to protect against the intensifying sun, tables laden with food that would feed the celebration following the formal rituals. Grace stood at the center of it all, wearing a white dress that Mary had sewn specially for the occasion, her blonde braids adorned with small silver bells that chimed softly when she moved. Around her neck hung a necklace of polished stones that Kestrel's own hands had crafted, each one representing a lesson she had learned during their weeks of friendship. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone much older, understanding instinctively that she was participating in something that would be remembered for generations. Mary Whitmore approached the gathering with visible nervousness, clutching the hidden land deed and Samuel's confession letter that would formally acknowledge her family's complex relationship to the disputed territory. She had spent hours preparing her remarks, wanting to honor both her father-in-law's memory and Apache rights that his actions had inadvertently violated. The settler families who had come to witness the ceremony watched her with expressions ranging from admiration to concern, understanding that her choices would affect all their relationships with Apache neighbors. Elder Joseph Running Bear began the ceremony with traditional prayers, his voice carrying across the desert, as he called upon the spirits of the four directions to witness and bless the agreements being made. The Apache participants responded with the ancient rhythms that had marked important tribal gatherings for countless generations, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to emerge from the land itself. Today, we gather not as strangers or enemies, Joseph proclaimed in both Apache and English, but as neighbors seeking the wisdom to share the gifts that the Great Spirit has given to all people. The mountain lion teaches us that the strongest hunter also knows when to show mercy. The eagle teaches us that true vision requires both distance and closeness. Today, we learn from these teachers as we forge new paths between our communities. Kestrel stepped forward, raising the eagle feather staff so that all present could sacred symbols. "I have guarded this land for 60 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. I have seen betrayal and loss, anger and sorrow. But I have also witnessed the miracle of a child's heart opening to ancient wisdom, the power of respect to transform fear into friendship. Grace Whitmore has shown us that the boundaries we believed were fixed can actually become bridges when approached with proper reverence." The mountain lion cub, now noticeably larger and more independent, sat quietly beside Grace as if understanding its role in the day's significance. Its mother watched from the rocks above, no longer hiding her presence as she had during those first nervous weeks. The acceptance that the lion family had shown toward both Apache and settler participants served as living proof that seemingly impossible relationships could flourish when built on mutual respect rather than dominance. Mary stepped forward when Kestrel nodded to her, the legal documents heavy in her hands. "My father-in-law came to this territory, seeking redemption for old mistakes," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "Instead, he created new wounds through actions he later regretted deeply. These documents reveal the truth about our family's claim to this land, truth that was hidden but not forgotten." She held up the original Apache agreement, its terms clearly visible to all present. According to this document, signed by Samuel Whitmore and witnessed by tribal leaders, our homestead was meant to be held in trust, with shared water rights and protected access to sacred sites. These terms were never honored, creating injustice that has poisoned relationships between our communities for 20 years. The admission sent ripples of reaction through both groups of witnesses. Some Apache faces showed satisfaction at finally hearing public acknowledgement of old grievances. Some settler faces displayed worry about the implications for their own land claims. But most participants simply listened with the gravity that the moment demanded, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the territory's turbulent history. Today, Mary continued, with the blessing of tribal elders and the support of my daughter, I propose that we finally honor the original agreement Samuel Whitmore signed, not through displacement or punishment, but through the shared stewardship that should have guided our relationship from the beginning. The unity blanket began as separate strands, Apache women contributing fibers dyed with traditional plants, settler women adding threads spun from wool and cotton they had brought west in their wagons. But as the ceremony progressed and the formal agreements took shape, the women of both communities worked together to weave those individual strands into patterns that honored both cultures while creating something entirely new. The blanket would remain in the teaching circle as a permanent symbol of what could be accomplished when different traditions combined their strengths. Grace stepped forward to participate in the cub release ceremonies that marked the transition from individual healing to community transformation. The young mountain lion had grown strong and confident during their weeks of friendship, but the time had come for it to reclaim its place in the wild family structure that would ensure its survival. With gentle hands and whispered words of farewell, Grace guided the cub toward the rocks where its mother waited with patient dignity. "Go well, little brother," Grace murmured, using the Apache phrase that Kestrel had taught her for bidding farewell to sacred animals. "Carry our friendship into the wild places, and remember that you will always be welcome in our hearts." The cub's reunion with its mother provided a moment of perfect symbolism as the ceremony reached its emotional peak. The powerful lioness nuzzled her offspring, examining it carefully for signs of harm, then looked directly at Grace with what could only be interpreted as acknowledgement and approval. For a long moment, the predator and the child held each other's gaze across the species divide, communicating in the wordless language that had made their friendship possible from the beginning. Elder Joseph, Running Bear, approached Grace with gouache, a beaded headband that had been crafted specifically for this ceremony. Its patterns, incorporating both Apache geometric designs and floral motifs favored by settler women. "You have earned a place in our people's memory," he said solemnly. "From this day forward, you will be known as Desert Rose One who blooms, with beauty in harsh places, bringing life and hope where others see only emptiness." The naming ceremony marked Grace's formal adoption into the extended Apache family network, a recognition that transcended blood relationships to acknowledge spiritual kinship. But it also established her role as a bridge between communities, someone who could move freely between worlds while belonging fully to both. The responsibilities that came with such a position were as significant as the honors, requiring wisdom and diplomacy that would grow with her over the years to come. Mary Whitmore stepped forward to sign a new land stewardship agreement that tribal lawyers and territorial officials had crafted during the weeks of preparation leading up to the ceremony. The document established unprecedented legal protections for sacred sites, while acknowledging the improvements and investments that settler families had made in disputed territories. Most importantly, it created mechanisms for ongoing cooperation in water management, agricultural development, and cultural exchange that would benefit both communities. This agreement represents more than legal arrangements, Mary declared as she signed the formal papers. It represents a commitment to the kind of partnership my husband dreamed of establishing, the recognition that we are all caretakers of this land rather than its owners. Kestrel accepted his new role as cultural liaison with a mixture of pride and trepidation, understanding that success would require him to adapt skills honed in decades of solitary guardianship to the very different challenges of community leadership. The position would allow him to continue protecting sacred sites and animal populations, while also serving as an educator and diplomat between cultures that had too often misunderstood each other's motivations and values. The shared feast that concluded the formal ceremony brought together foods and traditions from both communities, creating a celebration that honored diversity while building new bonds of friendship and mutual respect. Apache families contributed traditional dishes, prepared with desert plants and game, while settler families offered breads and preserves made from crops they had coaxed from the arid soil. Children from both communities played together with the easy acceptance that adults often struggled to achieve, their laughter echoing across the desert as the sun reached its zenith dot as the afternoon progressed, and participants began the gradual process of returning to their daily lives. The teaching circle remained active with smaller groups, engaged in the cultural exchange activities that would become regular features of intertribal cooperation. Apache elders demonstrated traditional crafts and shared stories of desert survival, while settler women taught reading and arithmetic skills that would help Apache children navigate the increasingly complex legal and economic challenges of territorial life. The mountain lion family settled into their protected territory with the secure knowledge that their presence was not only tolerated but celebrated by the human communities that shared their desert home. The mother lion's acceptance of the ceremonial proceedings had provided powerful spiritual validation for the agreements being made, confirming that the natural world approved of the harmony being established between human neighbors. As sunset approached and the last participants prepared to leave the transformed clearing, Grace stood with Kestrel beside the teaching circle stones, both of them understanding that their relationship had evolved far beyond its original boundaries to become something that would influence both their communities for generations to come. The unity blanket, nearly completed through the day's collaborative weaving, would remain as permanent testimony to what could be accomplished when different peoples chose cooperation over conflict, hope over the familiar comfort of old grievances. 6 months had transformed the desert landscape around the teaching circle in ways both subtle and profound. The stone circle where Grace and Kestrel had first bonded over a mountain lion cub now anchored a thriving center for cultural exchange. Its permanent markers weathered smooth by desert winds, but its significance growing stronger with each passing season. Apache children learned reading and arithmetic in the morning shade, while settler children discovered traditional plant medicine and animal tracking in the afternoon sun. Their mixed laughter carrying across red rock canyons that had witnessed so much conflict in generations past. Grace, now 9 years old and bearing the Apache name Desert Rose with quiet pride, had grown into her role as bridge between communities with the same natural grace she had shown in befriending wild predators. Her days followed rhythms that would have seemed impossible a year before, mornings spent helping her mother tend their expanded gardens, using techniques learned from Apache agricultural masters, afternoons serving as translator and guide for visiting families who came to observe the successful cooperation model that was drawing attention from territorial officials throughout the southwest. The teaching circle stones had become more than educational tools. They served as permanent reminders of the transformation that careful listening and mutual respect could accomplish. Each stone bore carvings that told the story of reconciliation, created through collaboration between Apache artisans and settler craftspeople who had discovered unexpected common ground in their shared love for the harsh beauty of desert life. Children from both communities could recite the circle's story by heart, understanding that they were inheriting something precious that previous generations had thought impossible. Kestrel's transformation, from solitary guardian to community. Liaison had proceeded with the same deliberate care he had once brought to tracking mountain lions across difficult terrain. His days were fuller now than they had been in decades, filled with teaching sessions, diplomatic meetings, and the complex negotiations required to extend the cooperation model to other disputed territories. But the loneliness that had marked his later years had been replaced by something far more sustaining: the knowledge that his lifetime of accumulated wisdom was being passed on to eager students, who would carry it into futures he could barely imagine. The mountain lion family had thrived under the protection afforded by the new territorial agreements. Their territory expanded, and their hunting grounds secured against the encroachment that had threatened so many other predator populations. The mother lion often appeared during teaching sessions, her presence no longer causing panic, but serving instead as a living reminder of the sacred relationships that careful stewardship could maintain between human and animal communities. Her grown cubs had established their own territories in the surrounding canyons, creating a healthy population that blessed the entire region with their powerful medicine. Mary Whitmore had discovered unexpected fulfillment in her expanded role as coordinator between Apache agricultural experts and settler farming families. Her kitchen had become an informal meeting place where traditional plant knowledge merged with innovations in food preservation and distribution, creating hybrid techniques that allowed both communities to thrive in the challenging desert environment. The partnership she had developed with Kestrel had deepened over the months into something that approached the marriage of minds and hearts that her late husband had always dreamed of finding with Apache neighbors. The legal precedent established by their land stewardship agreement had indeed influenced similar negotiations throughout the territory, just as tribal leaders had hoped and settler officials had feared. But rather than creating chaos or undermining property rights, the model had demonstrated that acknowledgement of indigenous claims could actually stabilize rather than threaten frontier communities. Other settlements had begun requesting guidance in establishing their own cultural exchange programs, seeking the economic and social benefits that cooperation had brought to the desert region around Tucson. The Unity Blanket, completed during that first ceremonial day and displayed permanently in the teaching circle, had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking examples of successful intertribal cooperation. Its patterns told the story of separate traditions, choosing to weave their individual strengths into something stronger and more beautiful than either could achieve alone. Visitors often spent hours studying its complex designs, searching for insights they could apply to their own community challenges. As autumn brought cooler temperatures and the seasonal migrations that marked desert transitions, Grace stood once again in the clearing where her friendship with Kestrel had begun, watching a new generation of mountain lion cubs play under their mother's watchful protection. The cycles of life continued with the same eternal rhythms that had governed this landscape for millennia, but now those cycles included human communities that had learned to participate rather than merely dominate or fear. "Do you remember what it felt like?" Kestrel asked, settling beside her on one of the teaching stones. "When you first saw the cub and didn't know whether to be afraid or amazed?" Grace considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had always characterized her approach to important matters. "I remember thinking that something sacred was happening, even though I didn't understand what it meant. Like the land itself was offering me a gift, but I had to prove I was worthy to receive it." "And now?" Kestrel prompted, curious about her perspective on the transformation they had all experienced. "Now I think the gift wasn't just for me," Grace replied, her voice carrying wisdom that continued to surprise adults who heard it. "I think the land was offering all of us a chance to remember how to live together properly. The cub was just a teacher who helped us remember." The simple profundity of her insight struck Kestrel as the perfect summary of everything they had accomplished together. A child's innocent respect for a wild creature had indeed become the catalyst for healing wounds that had seemed permanent. for building bridges across divides that had appeared unbridgeable. The mountain lion cub had grown up and claimed its place in the wild ecosystem that sustained all life in this harsh desert, just as Grace was growing into her role as keeper of the wisdom that would sustain human communities for generations to come. As the sun set over red rock formations that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that transcended all cultural boundaries, Kestrel felt the deep satisfaction that comes from fulfilling ancient responsibilities in unexpected ways. He had spent 60 years guarding sacred territory against threats both real and imagined. But perhaps his greatest service had been learning when to lower those guards and allow new forms of protection to emerge, through cooperation rather than isolation. The teaching circle stones would remain long after both he and Grace had joined the ancestors, their carved stories inspiring future generations to choose understanding over fear, partnership over domination, hope over the familiar, comfort of old grievances. And somewhere in the desert canyons that surrounded their peaceful clearing, mountain lions would continue to hunt and teach and raise their young in the timeless cycles that had blessed this land since the world began, knowing that at least one small corner of their domain was protected by humans who finally understood their sacred duty as caretakers rather than conquerors of the natural world.